It's funny, at least to me, to watch the religious desperately try to deny that their beliefs, their religious beliefs, have been debunked. Anything that can be has been. The stuff that's left over is empty claims based on faith, carefully hidden from rational evaluation by people who just don't care if any of it is actually true. So, sure, let's go do some more of that. This time out, we have a suggested video by John B. called Has Science Disproved Christianity? On a channel called Questioning Christianity. And I'll be honest, if this is how he questions his beliefs, I have no idea what embracing them would look like because this is about the same damn thing. This is, as with most religious videos, a theist assuming that everything that he already believes is true, no evidence required, complete with cherry-picking data points, ignoring actual history, and pretending that they can't possibly be wrong, no matter how wrong they are. In other words, it's just another day around here. So let's get started on the first half of this video just to see what's what, because I'm pretty sure the religious aren't going to get anywhere rational fast.
Do you have to choose between God and science? Well, one of the most common reasons cited for rejecting Christianity is the belief that God and science are locked in a perpetual war as two competing explanations for the universe.
Here's the problem, though. You can't just say, well, I have an explanation for the universe. You actually have to prove it. I could not legitimately claim that the universe can be best explained by invisible, intangible universe-creating pixies. Not if I wanted to be taken seriously at all. I mean, I could say it, but in so doing, I gain the burden of proof to show that my explanation is reasonable, rational, and most importantly, true. I have to learn how to support it by objective evidence. Just because I believe it, that doesn't mean that it actually happened as I described. Just because I can profess faith, that doesn't prove that it's real. And this is where every single theist that I have ever seen in my life fails miserably. They don't attempt to show that it's reasonable, rational, and certainly not that it's true, because that requires evidence, and sadly for them, they've got none.
With faith and religion in God's corner, well, fact and reason are on team science.
And there you go. Faith and religion don't mean anything. If it isn't good enough for the Hindu's faith to prove that Krishna is real, then your faith isn't good enough to prove that God exists. There are no double standards here, and that's what the religious absolutely depend on. This is why you can never allow the religious to run around with the goalposts. Pick a standard and stick to it. You don't get special dispensation just because it makes you happy. That's just dumb.
And with high-profile scientists moonlighting as vocal critics of religion, you could easily form the impression that modern science has progressively chased away the superstitious shadows of religious belief.
For the most part, yes. At least for anyone who follows the same methodology that makes science so demonstrably useful. The problem here is that most theists aren't at all concerned with whether or not their beliefs are factually correct. They just want to believe. If it doesn't matter to the Christian that the Hindu has faith, or that the Muslim has faith, or that the Scientologist has faith, then it doesn't matter if they have faith either. That's something they just don't want to hear.
After all, didn't the ancients used to invoke the gods to explain all manner of natural phenomena that they just didn't understand? Lightning, well, that was Zeus from Mount Olympus. And thunder, that was Thor, Chris Hemsworth, striking his hammer. And yet, the rise of modern science has meant that these gaps in our knowledge of the natural world, the ones religious people used to plug God into, are quickly disappearing, such that soon there will be no room left for God at all.
You know when I say that a theist is so close to comprehending, but they just can't take that last step? Yeah, that's this guy. He can't tell the difference between his blind faith and the blind faith of others. he's got to be special, while everybody else is wrong. Except he's not special. He's just as delusional as all the rest. Science has shown that religion is unnecessary except to the people who just want to believe. The only reason that nobody cares that Thor is a myth is because hardly anybody out there believes that Thor is real anymore. There are a few, but I'm not sure how seriously I take a lot of those people. If this had happened in the midst of the Roman era, then you can be sure that they'd be out there killing off the heretics, just like the Christians and the Muslims have done throughout their history. Christians like to pretend that Tacitus wrote about a real Jesus, but he also wrote about the religion of the Suebi in his first century work, Germania, who worshipped Thor and Mercury, Hercules and Mars, etc. Hercules in the Suebi religion was just another version of Thor. Christians would view this as mythology, while of course their own views represent history. But then again, so too would the Germanic people who believed in a Thor analog. That's what they'd say about Christians.
And so, Neil deGrasse Tyson summarizes the belief of skeptical scientists, that God is an ever-receding pocket of scientific ignorance.
And he's right. There has never, ever been a single question in the history of humanity that has positively, demonstrably been shown to be answered by a God. Any God. Every single time that somebody claims, God done it, science shows eventually that that was not the case. Yet the religious really like the idea of their gods, and while they're happy to say that other gods aren't real, they just can't quite get there about their own. Their God is special. Why? Because they say so. And I'm sorry, but that just doesn't make it so.
So what does the Christian story have to do with the study of nature? Has science disproved Christianity?
In every way that's currently possible, yes. The religious don't like that, of course, but so what? This is about truth and not about your feelings. How you feel about things are entirely irrelevant. Nobody ought to care. That anybody does, that shows the inherent weakness of their capacity to reason and be rational, and that's not something that anybody ought to be proud of.
Well, the simple truth is the conflict hypothesis that God and science are at war is a myth, one long abandoned by historians of science, even though it gets propagated today by well-meaning but misinformed secular thinkers.
No, that's not the case. Of course, who really cares about historians of science anyhow? That's like saying, according to New Testament scholars. But I don't care about New Testament scholars. I care about the evidence, and they're sadly lacking in any of that. Now, to some degree, I will acknowledge that he's correct, because there has never been a war between science and Christianity, any more than there's been a war between science and Bigfoot or science and flat earthers. One side is just wrong, and it's not science, at least not so far as we have any evidence for. Of course, the religious are really good at proclaiming that everybody's out to get them. There's the annual war on Christmas, for instance, even though that's laughably untrue. Christians lost that battle decades ago. This is just one more thing that they need to give up on, although it's highly doubtful that they will.
This conflict myth traces back to two 19th century figures, John William Draper and Andrew Dickson White, who intentionally recast the relationship between religion and science in a negative light, and crafted a conflict narrative to suit their own agenda.
Which means absolutely nothing. Now, I hope that somewhere in here he tries to justify any of this, even though I think we know that he can't, and if you ever talk to any actual scientists today, you wouldn't get a lot of those who would agree that there was ever a battle between science and God. Science just doesn't work that way. It's too busy looking for evidence and trying to figure out the best explanations for things beyond their own fee-fees. That's the purview of religion, after all. The reality is that the religious are the ones with a childish persecution complex. Everybody's out to get us. No, you're just wrong. telling you that you're wrong when you're wrong, that's not persecution, that's reality. Maybe you people need to get a grip.
As it turns out, the truth is far more interesting. For starters, let's begin with a simple observation, since that is a huge part of the scientific method. If God and science were at war, then you would expect to find a certain demographic of casualties strewn out across the intellectual battlefields, namely scientists who believe in God.
There aren't a lot of those if you notice. The ones that do exist, they tend to fall into the soft sciences. The hard scientists, the ones who deal with physical sciences, etc., they don't tend to buy into this religious nonsense at all, by and large. Remember, 93% of the National Academy of Sciences are atheists. This has been going on for a very, very, very long time, so it shouldn't be a surprise. Back in 2009, Pew Research polled members of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and they found that, at the time, 40% of respondents rejected belief in any gods. And remember, this is the time when Pew Research also found that 95% of Americans believed in some form of deity or higher power. The more science learns, the less scientists believe. It's always been that way and it always will, which is why religion has always sought out scientists for punishment or death. You can't compete with reality, no matter how hard you try.
For if God had been buried by science, then any scientist worth their salt would surely give up on their religious beliefs, right? The only problem is, it doesn't seem to be happening.
Except it does. Those numbers are increasing. This is why the religious are so interested in explaining why there are so many atheists rather than just admitting that they're losing. You are not going to find any of the Christian denominations that have been hemorrhaging members for decades being honest about it. They're all looking for scapegoats. It's not our fault that everybody thinks we're crazy. No, it's got to be something else. This is why videos like this are so ludicrous. They're trying to explain their way around the truth. They just can't accept the truth as what it is. You know, the truth.
A great many high-profile scientists are also believers in God. Francis Collins, who directed the Human Genome Project and headed up the National Institute for Health in the USA.
Sure, but his reason for becoming a Christian was because he found a waterfall frozen in 3 parts in the woods. That is not a rational, evidence-based reason to adopt any position whatsoever. He might be a brilliant scientist, and when it comes to his work in genetics, he absolutely is. But when it comes to his religious beliefs, he is entirely out of his mind. This is what we call compartmentalization. You wall off all the crazy parts over here when you're doing science, and when you're out there believing the religious wingnuttery, the science aspects are not permitted to intrude. And that's not something to be proud of either.
Jennifer Wiseman, who serves as the senior project scientist for NASA's Hubble Space Telescope.
And if you look at her talking about faith, science and religion never ever cross paths. In fact, she jumps to something entirely different as soon as her religious beliefs come up. She said, "We will likely never visit other planets, but through science, we can have the ability to understand our universe. It's a sign of God's love, and in turn, we'll turn that back into praise for our God." The second part has absolutely nothing to do with the first. It's complete dissociation from the reality of her scientific work to, God done it. Because that's what makes her happy. These are not people about whom you should be impressed.
And Gerhard Ertl, a Nobel Prize-winning chemist. And in case you're just worried that I'm cherry-picking these few, a survey of Nobel Prize winners across the 20th century reveals that more than 85% self-identified as either Christian or religiously Jewish, outing themselves as believers in God.
Sure, but if you start looking at more recent Nobel Prize winners in scientific fields, it's mostly atheists. Physics, for example. Virtually every winner from 2016 onward has been an atheist. The majority of the ones from 1999 onward have been atheists too. the more that we learn, the less these people need to rely on faith to get them through the day. Also, you notice that this guy is claiming Judaism on his side. Well, plenty of Nobel Prize winners who have been identified as Jewish were in fact ethnically Jewish or culturally Jewish, but they were open atheists. And that includes people like Richard Feynman, Niels Bohr, Rita Levi-Montalcini, among many others. How much do you want to bet that this guy just isn't admitting their actual positions?
So from this simple observation, we can draw a simple conclusion. That if science had disproved God, then someone forgot to tell an awfully large number of prize-winning scientists.
Modern scientists don't need to be told because, by and large, they don't believe in any gods. It's one reason that the religious always try to go back in time as far as they can. That way, they can live in an age where almost everybody took their ridiculous beliefs seriously. And this is not that time. It's time they stop pretending that it is. Religion is dying in the Western world. Good riddance to it.
And looking back even further in history, the scientific revolution, it didn't take place in a vacuum. Rather, it seems that the Christian story set the stage for the rise of modern science.
Not really. Now, sure, you have more people who believed in gods doing scientific work. That kind of thing is undeniable. But welcome back to compartmentalization. You had people who, through their culture and their upbringing, they were forced into religious adherence, but they also had to look at the real world, and then they realized that there was some pretty neat stuff out there going on. Now, in passing, based on their cultural predispositions, they may have concluded that God was ultimately responsible, but you notice that not one of them, not one theist in history, has ever actually demonstrated that to be the case. It's just faith, and faith doesn't get you anywhere, especially in science. Just because you really want it to be true, that doesn't mean that it is.
In pondering why science exploded in a Christianized Europe, as opposed to in Africa or Asia centuries before, historians of science have landed on a consensus that the Christian story provided the intellectual soil and motivational fertilizer out of which the scientific method could ultimately grow.
Not remotely true. Oh, I'm sure you really want that to be the case, but it's just not. The Muslims could say the same thing about the revolution in the Middle East that saw the beginning of modern mathematics. Modern chemistry got its start with the ancient Greeks long before Christianity was even a gleam in anyone's eye. There were scientific revolutions going on in the Far East, and it's funny how the only ones any of them want to talk about are in Europe, because that's the only place that actually fits their narrative. There were lots of things going on in Europe at the time, things that had absolutely nothing at all to do with religion, and that made it a lot more likely for scientific breakthroughs to occur. This guy is a real imbecile.
You see, the Christian story teaches that 1, our universe is rationally ordered by an eternal mind. So the forces of nature are static, they follow laws, rather than being changing with the ever-fickle whims of capricious deities.
And this is where they tend to get into trouble, one of many places. If you really think about it, they're just shooting themselves in the foot. If their God is unchanging, if there are supposed objective truths out there, then reality couldn't exist at all. Hell, the Bible couldn't exist as it does because the Bible records several instances of God demonstrably changing his mind. How does that work exactly? How does a deity that knows absolutely everything that could ever happen, how does that deity ever regret anything? Genesis 6:6, and the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. How exactly does that work?
That 2, humanity is made in God's image, with rational minds of our own that have the capacity to unlock the secrets that God has woven into the fabric of creation.
Well, that's your story. Unfortunately, just because you have a story, that doesn't mean that your story is true. We can find stories in other religions claiming the same kind of thing, that Allah made Adam in his image. Granted, they seem to think that Adam was a giant 60 cubits tall, which translates into about 90 feet, and I bet Christians aren't going to take that one seriously, are they? Nor should they. These people are just emotionally attached to the silly tales in their silly books. I don't care about your beliefs. I care about your facts. Come on back when you've got some.
That 3, God gave humanity in Genesis the cultural mandate to study creation in order to harness its potential.
Well, guess what? Other religions do the exact same thing. Big deal. Go read the Upanishads sometime. There are a lot of very, very clear parallels between Hinduism and Christianity, and Hinduism has been around a whole lot longer. In fact, it's hard not to find all kinds of older mythologies that were adopted into Christianity and Judaism. The story of Noah getting drunk and his son getting disowned, that's not original to the Jews. You can find elements of Greek Gnosticism, Zoroastrian dualism, elements of Hinduism and Buddhism, etc., etc., etc. The more you know, the less likely any of them seem to be. They've all just copied from each other. It only takes a little dispassionate investigation and study to figure that one out.
And that 4, humanity were damaged by evil, meaning as fallen creatures, we can either fudge our results or misinterpret the data, and so we require a system of external and repeatable measurement and peer review that could guard against our darker demons and promote the search for truth.
Just like every other religion out there. Again, you've got a multitude of examples here. Ancient Judaism had a different view of sin than modern Christians do. There, you had 3 levels of transgressing against God. Muslims had a different view. In Islam, sin is an act, it's not a state of being. Humans are not born sinful. Humans may be predisposed towards sin, but they are not born being irrevocably evil. Sin exists in Hinduism, Buddhism, even Baha'i, and they're trying to promote humans as naturally good, but still, with their beliefs, sin exists. It's pretty hard to find any religion out there without some kind of sin concept. But I'm sure he doesn't know that, nor does he probably care.
Which is why when you survey the fathers of modern scientific fields, Newton and Kepler, Faraday and Pascal, they were all of them believers in God, Jesus, and the Christian story.
Notice he's at least 150 years out of date on all of those, right? That's why they do it. They can't talk about modern science because modern science doesn't take their religion seriously, and they can't have that. It's why they embrace the past and they are absolutely terrified of the present, because the present doesn't get them where they desperately want to go.
Far from seeing their Christian faith as a hindrance to their endeavors, they genuinely believe that God inspired their science.
And that doesn't matter. What they believed, what you believe, none of that means a damn thing. Either a thing is true or it's not. Your feelings don't have anything at all to do with it. This is one thing that the religious, and it's not just Christians, it seems to be all of them, it's something that they just can't handle. Well, here's some stuff that happened a long, long time ago, back when we had some control over the world, and therefore listen to that stuff and ignore the other stuff that makes us look bad. It's positively childish. It really is.
Johann Kepler remarked in his study of mechanics that he was thinking God's thoughts after him. Isaac Newton argued in his Principia Mathematica that this was intended to move people from perceiving the rational order in the universe to then believing in an intelligent creator.
Yes, it's intended to sway people away from being rational, reasonable people into being religious zombies. That's not something to be proud of. He then goes on to quote C.S. Lewis, and I think you all know how little respect I have for him, so let's just pause here for the day and wrap it up next time, lest it get too ridiculously long. Now, you notice that he hasn't gotten into any actual science yet, right? Nor has he addressed anything that his religion says that science can evaluate. This isn't a question about science disproving Christianity. I don't think he really understands the mechanisms by which that could happen, nor the requirements on his side of the aisle that he and his ilk need to address in order to show themselves in line with any kind of rational scientific inquiry. Why? Because they don't give a crap. They just want to believe. And he's just another example of why religion and the religious are such a ludicrous joke. Anyway, thanks once again to John B. We'll be back in a couple of days with the last half, and if you have anything to say on this so far, by all means, let me know down in the comments. Until then, stay sane. Why are the religious just so clueless? I mean, every single video that we look at, you have a theist running around with a faith hat on, bumping into things because they just can't see reality. The moment that you try to explain to them what the hell they're doing wrong, they just stick their fingers in their ears because they just don't want to hear. What is wrong with these people? Let's try to find out. Welcome back to part 2 of the video, and I'm sorry to have to say this, but it's not going to get any better from here. But then again, when do religious videos ever improve? This is just another Has Science Disproved Christianity video over on the Question Christianity channel from somebody who is clearly not questioning Christianity. Why is that not a surprise? So anyway, let's get back to the action already in progress.
And beyond how belief in the Christian story opened the door for the scientific revolution, many of the subsequent discoveries of science, far from pointing away from God, actually make more sense in light of God's existence.
Such as... Now, I know this is just going to be an exercise in confirmation bias, but I'd really like to know. I see the religious making claims like this all the time, but they are racing to their emotionally comforting conclusion instead of just following the evidence to see where it leads. That's why none of these people make any sense at all. You can't just say, see, that proves God, if you haven't got any evidence for God's existence in the first place. Just because you really like the idea, that doesn't make God real. That's why the second that they give this a shot, I tell them to back it up without faith. Because faith isn't a verifiable path to objective truth. It doesn't get you to reality. It's just crap that you happen to like for emotional reasons. And that doesn't mean God done it. You have to prove God first.
Take, for instance, the discovery that our universe, space, time, matter, and energy, does not stretch back infinitely, but that it had an absolute beginning at some finite point in the past.
Now, that's debatable at best. Our particular instantiation of space-time seems to have had a beginning, but that doesn't mean that all of space and all of time, the entire cosmos, did. That's just an assertion on the part of the religious, and of the many cosmological models that we've come up with, virtually none of them would agree. But even if we were willing to grant that, not that I'm saying that we should, but even if we did, simply for the sake of argument, that still doesn't get them to any gods, much less the God that this guy really wants to reach. It might get them to a creator of some sort, but that doesn't prove that said creator had any of the properties stapled on by the religious, or that that creator was making things on purpose, or that that creator is still around today. It doesn't prove a personal deity done it. We're just left with, well, there might be something. What that something might be, I don't know, and neither do you. So stop pretending you do.
This discovery has strengthened one of the key premises in a famous philosophical argument for God's existence, the cosmological argument.
That's been about as soundly debunked as any philosophical argument ever can be. It doesn't even mention any gods. It just says, well, the universe had a cause, and it just leaves it at that. The religious are the ones with the goalposts running around leaping to the unwarranted conclusions that it has to be a god. Moreover, it has to be their god that done it. But that doesn't make it true. And this brings us right back to those questions that they have no answers for. How do they know it? And more importantly, how have they tested it to see if it actually stands up to any kind of critical muster? You don't just get to assign your pet cause to it because that's what you really want to be true. You have to back it up, and they're not even giving that a good faith attempt. If they get to do it, well, anybody else does too. Invisible, intangible, universe-creating pixies. They did it. Prove me wrong. The lint at the bottom of my sock drawer. It did it. Why not? I mean, you have to actually demonstrate a direct causal link between what you're claiming is created and the thing you're claiming created it. And the religious, they're not even trying to do that. Wonder why.
Or take the discovery of the highly improbable calibration of the initial conditions of our universe, the ones that allow for intelligent life to develop.
What about it? Because here too, they're just playing goalpost bingo. What's the standard of intelligent life that they're demanding? Well, us. But why us? Because they have an emotional attachment to humanity. That doesn't mean that we're the only standard of possible intelligent life. I already went through some of that in another video. Humans could be entirely impossible, and the universe still could, hypothetically, produce intelligent life that wasn't us. Whether they like it or not, we're just not that hot. Get over yourselves.
This scientific data has led to the development of a teleological line of reasoning known as the fine-tuning argument.
Which is just nonsense once you realize that we aren't that special. It really falls apart the second that you give it 2 seconds of your time, since the universe is clearly not made for us. Even huge swaths of our own planet are deadly to humans without significant technological development. Beyond our world, we're screwed. How can the universe be finely tuned for life when only a very, very, very narrow temperate zone on a single planet that we are aware of in the universe will support us? If you go anywhere else, any of that stuff is going to kill us. This is why these people are such a ludicrous joke. They are not using the 2 brain cells that they have in their heads to come up with anything remotely rational. Not that they care, they just really want to believe.
Which, when combined with discoveries like the surprising way that abstract mathematics maps on to the physical world, or the way that biological organisms are comprised of irreducibly complex information systems.
Both of which are just nonsense. We made mathematics up. Why? Because we were seeking to understand the way the world around us works. In fact, as we learn more and find that our mathematical prowess isn't all that great, we've had to build entirely new mathematical models specifically because that's what it takes for the universe to make sense. Math isn't something that just exists absent the human brain. It's something that we made up for a specific purpose. It works because it was invented to work. As to a second point, that's utter nonsense too. Any claims that they make, from the eye to bacterial flagellum, science just looks at their claims, laughs hysterically, and then shows the formation of this supposedly irreducibly complex organism is absolutely nothing of the sort. The reason that these people fall for it is because they're stupid. And that's what it ultimately comes down to. They are looking for emotional comfort, desperate to get back to that conclusion that they made up in their heads because it makes them feel good, and they're just squinting at the world just so they can get where they desperately want to go. As I keep saying, they are not following the evidence that we have to the most logical conclusion that we can come up with. They are cherry-picking ideas and leading it around by the nose until they get where they want to be.
It seems our universe bears the unmistakable appearance of design.
No, it bears your interpretation of design. That's all. You are just inordinately attached to the idea of humanity and things as they are, and because that's the only way you can imagine things are going to be, you're just inventing bald rationalizations for why that is how it is. And I hate to say it, but you're just doing intelligence wrong. Knock it off.
You see, this ordered structure in our cosmos is what recently prompted Ard Louis, professor of theoretical physics at Oxford University, to observe in conversation with Morgan Freeman, I think the more we learn about the world, it points towards God rather than less.
Maybe, and just hear me out here, but maybe instead of talking to an actor, you might try running some of that by, I don't know, actual scientists. They won't, of course, because it will reveal the utter absurdity of their beliefs, but that's probably a good idea. Better to talk to somebody who once played God in a couple of movies than to take your ideas to people who are just going to laugh in your face. Maybe you should just figure it out.
So far from burying God, if anything, it seems that science is resurrecting a rational belief in God.
Only if you know absolutely nothing at all coherent about science, which sadly I figure describes this guy to a T. If you don't understand it, you can't be wrong, right? Unfortunately, that's just not how it works. This is why the religious fare so badly in science, philosophy, logic, reason, anything but blind childish faith. They've got a goal in mind. It's also why they only want to talk to people who already believe. That means they don't have to face any of the hard questions that we would likely ask them, or the reality that they just don't have a single clue. Again, why are these people not trying to publish in peer-reviewed scientific journals? Because by and large, they aren't. They're not even trying. There have been surveys done that show that very, very, very few articles are even submitted by religious wingnuts. It's not that they're being turned down, it's that they're not even making an effort.
Now, while science can unearth a great deal about the history of our universe, when it comes down to it, disproving God is simply not in its purview.
That's really your fault, though, more than anything else. I mean, not his specifically, I didn't mean that, but religion has purposely picked up their toys and hidden them away beyond the ability of rational science to examine them. And they did that for a reason. They are terrified that if they leave their imaginary friends out there lying around where anybody else can find them, they're going to be proven wrong. Therefore, they simply declare arbitrarily and with no evidence whatsoever that my God can't be discovered. Well, that's not the slam dunk that you seem to think that it is. If that's the case, how did you find out about it? I mean, demonstrably. Well, my God told me he was real. Sure, okay. That sounds like you've got some problems upstairs. Those people over there, they say their God's real too. How about that? Well, yeah, but they're wrong. Funny, because they say the same thing about you. So that brings us right back to square one, and these people don't even know how badly they're losing. Kind of sad, right?
For as much as the tools of science are a tremendous gift to the tool belt of human knowledge, not every question has a scientific answer. Science has limits.
Any question that has to do with the existence, characteristics, or operation of the universe does. Anything that is in or interacts with the universe in any way, science is the only tool for the job. We have never, ever, ever, not even once, found anything that demonstrably exists that cannot be described by science. And that includes your imaginary friend. If it was real, science could discover it. That science can't, and in fact, according to you lunatics, it is absolutely impossible for science to even try. That just shows what a complete load of nonsense it all is. You don't get to have it both ways, no matter how hard you try.
Being bound to purely observe the physical universe, science has no access to the metaphysical.
Because there's no rational reason to think that there is a metaphysical in the first place. Now, I guess it depends on what you mean by that, but I figure that he's talking about the supernatural, and that's just downright silly. In fact, I think that there's a lot of stuff talked about in philosophy that's also pretty damn ridiculous and has absolutely no bearing whatsoever on anything, but maybe that's something for another video someday. Maybe. I don't know. Let me know what you think in the comments. It gets right back to noodling your navel for no good reason, and I got no time for that.
It cannot ultimately adjudicate on the God question. It cannot move from describing what is to pontificating about what ought to be.
Nor can faith do anything of any value whatsoever. Just because you want something to be true, just because you have an emotional attachment to your beliefs, that doesn't mean that any of it is actually so. I am only interested in what is actually true. Saying, well, it sounds good to me, that doesn't mean anything. You need to have a way to move from your wishes and your dreams and your emotionally comforting fantasy life to actual demonstrable objective reality. And there are no mechanisms, not in religion and not in philosophy, to separate what you wish was true from what is actually true in any way that is verifiable or defensible. And that's the problem. You people just aren't living in the real world.
And it cannot repeat the past in order to prove what did or did not happen in history.
Which is why, whether you like it or not, and I know there's a lot of people out there who will hate this, but history really isn't all that important. Now, I know there's a lot of people out there that are going to hate that fact, especially all of the unemployed history majors, of which I know several, but there's really no point in knowing the exact specifics of the past. I mean, those who don't know anything about history are doomed to repeat it. We get that part. I'm talking about Joe Blow from Kokomo stood on this exact spot and said these exact words. Who cares? Big deal. It doesn't teach us anything about where we're going, and since we're not going to be going backwards anytime soon, so what?
So as soon as we step into questions of metaphysics, ethics, or even human history, we simply move beyond the authority of the sciences to speak.
And who says otherwise? This is where I really get sick of people who are looking for authority and lack the capacity to act on their own accord. They can't think for themselves. And that's a real problem these days, not just among the religious. People running around screaming, well, tell me what to do! Tell me what to do! Figure it out! Now, granted, most of that comes from a lack of credible parenting, people who have never had to make any decisions on their own because their parents never allowed them to even try, and certainly they never allowed them to fail, but that's a big problem too, and beyond the scope of this video. Sorry. It's not a particularly new problem, though, and we will see throughout history that the religious have always wanted guidance from above because it's just too scary to have any of that weight on their own shoulders. People just don't want to be responsible. Therefore, they just pass the buck. Well, God told me to do X, or the devil made me do it. The second you take away those convenient excuses, people tend to freak out. Maybe it's just time everybody grew the hell up.
Ultimately, where many people who pose this science objection get tripped up is by confusing two different types of explanations. Suppose I were to ask you, well, why are you watching this video? And you answered, well, the pixels on my screen are emitting light, which then passes through the lenses of my eye. There, the images and the arrangement of letters are translated into electrochemical signals, which, along with the sound emitted and then picked up by the reverberations in my eardrums, are interpreted in my brain via centers for language and memory, forming them into coherent thoughts that convey meaning to my conscious mind.
And that was a really long way to go, only for me to tell you that you're wrong. Because the question that you asked was why, and the explanation that you proposed was how. Those are two entirely different things. And this is a problem that a lot of people seem to have, although around here we see it a lot from the religious. They don't seem to know what those two things are or how they're different. They're looking for meaning and purpose, not description and mechanism, which is what he just described. If you asked me why I watched this video, I'd tell you. I watched it not only because it was suggested to me, thanks to John B. once again for that, but I honestly wanted to know what he had to say. Your video posed a question. Has science disproved Christianity? I wanted to see how you answered that question, and sadly, you've done an absolutely terrible job. I'm not really surprised at that because virtually every theist that we look at is piss poor at everything, but I had to give you a chance, and now that I've seen your content, all I can do is just roll my eyes and call you an idiot because that's what you've proven yourself to be. Maybe, just maybe you shouldn't do that. Just a helpful hint.
Well, I might be impressed at your answer, at your wit, but you haven't really answered the question that I asked.
Neither have you. I mean, I did, but I suspect you wouldn't care if you even bothered to watch the video, and frankly, I don't think most theists have the guts to watch things critical of their echo chamber. Can we get anywhere remotely close to a point here? Because that would sure be nice.
You gave me a mechanistic explanation using science. You explained how you are watching. But what I was really looking for was a personal explanation or an explanation of agency. Not the how, but the why. To which the answer might be something like, because I'm searching for answers to life's deepest questions.
No, I'm not. I'm watching you make a complete fool of yourself. However, I think I get what he's trying to get at, so let's just address that. I gave you my personal answer, which I figure you won't like, but there it is anyhow. And now you're just trying to be a condescending jackass and thinking that people are going to answer in a specific way so that you can make the points you want to make. The fact is, it's all science all the way down. I watched your video based on conclusions that I made in my brain, caused by electrochemical impulses that caused me to click on your video, yada yada yada. See, that's the problem here, because you're assuming that science and philosophy are two entirely different things, and they're really not. It all comes from the same place, and that place isn't supernatural in any way, at least not that we have ever seen any demonstrable evidence for. You have just reached an entirely intellectually unjustifiable conclusion based on the chemicals rattling around in your brain, and now you think you're special. But you're not. The one who is doing this all wrong is you. Knock it off.
You see, the how and the why, the mechanism and the agency, are not competing explanations. They are perfectly complementary. Because as much as we can learn about how you take in videos from science, we can learn nothing about why you are watching them from that same enterprise. For that, you have to open your mouth and speak.
Yes, you can. Psychology is a science. It's not a physical science, but it is a science all the same. You can look at neuroscience, for example, of which there are a lot of different varieties, and all of this can tell you why you do the things that you do, what impact your past, your beliefs, your brain structure, etc., have on the ideas that are just rattling around in your head right now. Unfortunately, you'd much rather believe in imaginary father figures in the sky to explain it, and that's just delusion on your part. Just because you want it to be true, that doesn't make it true. I shouldn't have to repeat that as much as I do, but there you go.
And the same is true when it comes to science and God. Science can tell us a great deal about how the universe operates, but it cannot tell us why it exists.
That assumes that there is a why. It presumes that there is a purpose to it. Demonstrate that purpose in some independently verifiable way. You can't. You can just assume it because it strikes an emotional chord in your brain. But that doesn't make it true. You are looking for something that doesn't demonstrably exist just because you wish that it did. And in so doing, you are making a complete fool of yourself. Maybe you ought to rethink that.
For that, God has to open his mouth and speak. And when it comes to God and the Christian story where God speaks, I know of no serious scientific reason to disbelieve anything Jesus said about who you are, why you are here, and where you are going.
But you haven't proven that any of that ever happened at all. That is, yet again, just an assertion on your part. It's a belief, but beliefs don't mean anything without rational justifications. You're just spouting emotionally comforting stories that you read about in a book that I have no reason whatsoever to take seriously. Flapping your lips doesn't make objective truth. Come on back when you have some of that.
If anything, science should give you some good reasons to tune into him more carefully.
And it would if there was any evidence at all that God was real. See, here's where the religious entirely miss the mark. And I know I've said it before, but they'll say, well, God can't be detected by science. And then they expect people to just believe it anyhow. Why? What other thing in your life would you ever allow that kind of claim to affect? Probably nothing, at least I hope not. You can't just come up with tall tales about imaginary friends just because you really like the idea and think that everybody else is just going to fall into line. It doesn't work that way. The whole video is all about, well, Jesus this and God that. But never once did he ever stop to show that any of these things were actually real. Yet, if a Hindu were to say, well, Krishna this and Brahma that, there's no chance in hell that he'd just go along for the ride, right? Of course not. If I made claims about Bobo the tree god, would he just nod and accept that as true? No, he'd ask for evidence, at least I hope he would, and nothing would happen until I provided it. They can't see that they're the hypocrites. They have an automatic double standard for their imaginary friends. Just because it sounds really good to them, it's got to be true for everyone, but it doesn't work like that. And this is why any theological discussion needs to hinge immediately on, is that God real, and how do you know it? How can you prove it to me? If you can't, then there's just no discussion to be had. You might as well be talking about Harry Potter. Come on back when you have some actual evidence to provide. I don't mean, well, it sounds good to me. I mean evidence. Until then, you're just wasting everyone's time. So anyway, thanks once again to John B. for suggesting the video. If you see anything out there that you want me to take a look at, just post a direct link in the comments on any video, or you can send me an email. It's in the description. And thanks for hanging around for this very, very, very long and pretty dry talk. Anyway, I'll catch you all next time.